Hi everybody, welcome. This is the Center for Climate Action and Sustainability lecture series. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Evergreen's Olympia campus is located on the territories of the Squaxin Island tribe. The Squaxin Island tribe's habitation on these lands is and around the inlets of the southern Salish Sea, including what is now the city of Olympia and this campus, Evergreen, spans thousands of years. I encourage you all to learn more about our place. There's many resources on campus, including the Squiggly Alt House of Welcome just over there. Many of you, I'm sure, have been in there and learned about the indigenous and native issues in our area. It's also the Native Cases collection online. I encourage you to check that out. Lots of really great case studies about native and tribal issues in our area. And the Olympia Hidden Histories Project, which maybe some of you are students who were involved in that project in Zoltan Grossman's class. Without further ado, I just wanted to introduce our speakers and our theme today. So with the climate lecture series, we've heard about everything from pipeline resistance to climate anxiety. And today we're taking a little bit of a different topic. We're going to be looking at questions of biodiversity loss and extinction with two experts on that topic. Joining us from just north of here in Vancouver, British Columbia. Our first speaker is, they're doing a research project together, which they'll talk about and share with us today. Rosemary Collard is an associate professor in geography at Simon Fraser University, specializing in the political economy of environmental change. And Jess Dempsey is an associate professor and associate head of the undergraduate program in geography at the University of British Columbia, also involved in their Center for Climate Justice, which probably some students might be interested in hearing more about. But yeah, I'm just going to keep it short and sweet. We have a smaller audience today and just want to keep a nice conversation. So if you have questions, please hold those to the end. We can have a group discussion. I think Jess and Rosemary will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, talking about their project, and then we'll get into a discussion for the rest of the time. So please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. How are you doing? Good? Yeah, okay. Thanks so much for having us here. I was telling Anthony that I have 3 cousins that all graduated from Evergreen, just in case you wanted to know.
Establish your credibility.
More, yeah, I don't know what that does for me, but I'm Canadian, but my cousins are American. Anyway, they speak very highly of their education here, so happy to be here. All right, so Rosemary and I were human geographers and political ecologists, economists, studying environmental change from the perspective of power. Probably this is at the core of many of your courses as well. Who and what specifically drives change and why, who benefits and who loses. The primary environmental change we study together, as Anthony said, is biodiversity loss and decline in wild animal abundance in particular. A lot of our research focuses on that, I wanted to say guy, but that animal. Endangered caribou, illustrated here. This is from our website, which has lots of our papers and research if you're interested. And we've been working on this project for 5 years, 5 or more years, yeah, something like that now. Okay. So we're in a paradoxical moment when it comes to trends in wildlife decline. This graph really captures what we call the extinction paradox. Wild animal abundance has nosedived over the past half century. The line in red shows a conservative measure of wild animal abundance. It's calibrated to 1 in 1970. An index value of 0.5 corresponds to global wild animal populations being, on average, about half the size they were in 1970. It shows that global populations of vertebrate species have declined by an average of 60% in less than 50 years. Updated data, not reflected on this graph, now puts that decline at 70%. Now, at the same time, we've spent our whole lives alongside really enormously inspirational, diverse international movements and people, pushing for environmental protection, demanding the fair share of the global commons for humans and non-humans. Since 1972, environmental laws have increased 38-fold worldwide, and governments have passed just like really hundreds and hundreds, thousands of internationally negotiated decisions to stem ecological decline. And there have never been so many formal policies to protect the environment. So that's the blue line on this graph that shows there are almost 1,400 pieces of domestic legislation worldwide to protect endangered species. That's very somber. I'm sorry to sound like that, but it is somber. So in this world of biodiversity and also climate politics, there's something going on between the flurry of science, the action, the activism, the lawmaking, and what comes out the other end, these grim patterns of enduring, even worsening destruction. And so it's critical to understand this between, right? Because while there's growing recognition that efforts are failing, the dominant solutions on offer continue on the same path, sort of fingers crossed. So our research really looks to that between in order to explain the extinction paradox. How can we have this situating of accelerating loss of wild abundance in a time of this unprecedented protection? Okay. So scientists really do tell us what's causing diminishing wild abundance. This is not a secret, right? Studies show that first, extractive land use change is the number1 driver by a long shot. Extraction here, we mean mining, large hydro dams, industrial forestry, industrial agriculture, oil and gas extraction. Recent science suggests that 80% of biodiversity loss is caused by extractive activities. Extraction is a bigger driver than all other drivers, including climate change, at least so far combined. We also know that extraction rates globally have more than tripled over the same period shown in the graph. So the more direct, really surface-level, proximate explanation of the extinction paradox is that the protective policies aren't slowing extractive land use change. So the question for us becomes more of a social science one. What holds extraction in place? This is the central kind of research question we've been trying to answer. And our starting point is that we have to look at the state to really answer this question. For some, this is sort of like an obvious institution to look to. For others, it might be curious. Curious because it's common in environmental circles, including scientists, to really point to market forces, consumption and production, as the kind of root cause holding biodiversity degrading extraction in place. A prime example of this is, say, something like deforestation, Amazonian deforestation. The story there is often one of growing meat consumption, which is linked to agricultural expansion, including of things like soy used to feed cattle. And this is, of course, certainly a factor. But we put states at the heart of the extinction paradox because states really mediate these market forces, right? They mediate production and consumption. And so I'm going to say a little bit more then about the state, because maybe you're thinking like Washington State or California. We call them provinces in Canada. But by the state, we mean a set of institutions, rules, and actors, elected politicians, bureaucrats, the judiciary, and the wider citizenry, as well as ideas, laws, policies, and procedures that really facilitate coercive power and the capability to govern with a monopoly on legitimate use of force over a defined territory. Now, of course, states are paradoxical themselves. On the one hand, the state passes all the policies meant to protect, curb, and recover endangered wildlife, all the laws and agreements graphed on that first slide. Unlike in climate, with its incentives and market-based policies, much biodiversity, approach to biodiversity is more command and control like the Endangered Species Act or Protected Areas establishment. On the other hand, so on the one hand, the state's passing all the policies to protect. On the other hand, the state is really authorizing all of the extractive development that's causing the majority of ecological loss. Not only that, the state often subsidizes this development, provides infrastructure for it, polices resistance to extraction, and promotes it, right? Say in trade missions and also domestically too. Sometimes the state even owns these developments and infrastructure. A good example is a pipeline expansion that you may have heard of that's literally in our backyards, bringing tar sands bitumen from Edmonton in Alberta to coastal terminals near where we live and right where Rosemary works. This is the terminus of that pipeline, known as Trans Mountain Pipeline, or in local lingo, TMX. Do people know about this pipeline? Yeah. Okay. So this pipeline will facilitate the production of about 84 million tons per year of carbon emissions. So this is like 8 million gas-powered cars on the roads per year, this expansion. Using the social cost of carbon of around $200 a ton, a BC-based economist suggests the pipeline will create $16.8 billion in annual future damages, annual. So the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh Indigenous nations took the government to court in expansion to this on their territories. It was universally decried by environmentalists, but also by many residents, local residents in Vancouver. In its own environmental impact assessment, the Canadian government found that this expansion and the associated tanker traffic would have significant threats to endangered orca whales. But it approved the expansion anyway, citing the public interest. But that is not all. When the original owner, Kinder Morgan, became aware of the risks and costs of this pipeline expansion project, including the risks from Indigenous opposition, and decided to back off, the federal government, the Canadian government, stepped in to purchase the pipeline in 2018 for $4.5 billion and committed to deliver the expansion at a then projected cost of $7.4 billion. That cost ballooned to $12 billion in 2020 and is now estimated around $31 billion. So this is a huge subsidy by the state and a literal nationalization of a pipeline in Canada. This dynamic I presented here captures really like a long-standing insight in political economy and ecology, right? The state is like a heterogeneous, not always aligned set of institutions and relations that are relatively autonomous from capital, to use Palancis's term. The state undertakes policies that sometimes counter the interests of resource capital. I think Biden has done some of this actually very recently here in the US. Canada announced a $1 billion conservation fund in the last year. In other words, the state is really tasked with protecting citizens from market forces, as Karl Polanyi tells us in The Great Transformation. But it is also tasked with promoting extraction and promoting capitalist interests in extraction. And what we see really over the long term is that state's sort of promoter role trumps its protector role over and over again, playing a sort of relatively powerful and relatively predictable role in supporting capitalist production and fueling ecological crisis. And so for us, where this lands, and then I'm going to pass it to Rosemary, is that the state doesn't just fail at conservation, at conserving ecosystems, it actively enacts the world that is then in need of conservation. In our research, thank you, the state lies at the heart of this puzzle of the extinction paradox. And now Rosemary's going to do more.
Hey, everybody. It's very nice to be here. So, as Jess laid out, we are really interested in this question of what holds extraction in place, given that context and a bit of a theoretical framework that Jess laid out. And our two main research questions in trying to get at that are, the first is kind of a who and what question. So who benefits from extraction, who bears the costs, and what systems of power uphold those geographical distributions of costs and benefits? And then the second question is a why question of why does the state fuel extraction, and especially why does it fuel extraction that harms endangered species that the state is committed to protect? So who and what benefits, who and what bears the costs, why does the state do what it does? And our focus in our research is on Canada for the most part, although we are interested in global examples of this as well of which there are many. But one of the reasons we focus on Canada is because it is still, to some extent, known globally as a bit of an environmental leader. And many of the explanations for why states do what they do, they don't have enough resources to protect biodiversity. These just don't hold for Canada, right? It's supposed to be an environmental leader. So we focus on Canada, and our method is something that we've started calling applied critical social science research. So in some ways, this is quite tedious work. It's like inductive content analysis of hundreds and hundreds of pages of government decision-making documents like environmental assessment materials, corporate financial statements where we've enlisted some collaborators from economics and accounting, and looking at government data as well on resource extraction approvals and so on. And our aim across that tedious work is to really start to try to identify patterns in what the state's doing. What environments is the state enacting or bringing into being? What are the logics behind state decisions? And we've complemented that with some sprinkles of interviews throughout, but some field visits. And the field visits have really, or the one field visit has focused in a place where a lot of our analysis has focused, which is northeast British Columbia. And this is a relatively close to home place for us and a real hotspot of extraction and species endangerment. So we focused on Northeast BC in a region called the Peace River region. This is towns like Fort St. John or Chetwynd. Has anybody been to the Peace River region? Whoa, Anthony. So I teach these huge classes at SFU, and in those classes, almost nobody has been up there either. It's actually a very interesting dynamic because so much of our energy and resource materials come from this part of the province, and it's somewhere that no one in the south has been. So this is Treaty 8 territory, and I will come back to the treaty. It's the territory specifically of West Moberly First Nations and Saulteaux First Nation. And caribou are a crucial species for many Indigenous nations across the continent, but especially to these nations, caribou are considered a relative. The ability to hunt caribou is central to these nations' legal systems, cultural transmission, knowledge systems, and economies, really, especially. But the herds in the Peace River region, the caribou herds, are predicted to go extinct within our lifetime. And these nations have not hunted caribou since the 1970s, when elders suggested or requested that a moratorium be put in place, a moratorium that has very high costs, interrupting those economies and knowledge transmission systems that I just described. So the caribou have not been hunted for many decades. In 2014, as herd members in the region were dropping down to mere dozens, West Moberly and Saulteaux took matters into their own hands, and they built and have since run a 15-hectare maternal caribou pen. It's pictured here. It's called the Clinsay Za Pen. It's a very magical place that we were able to visit last summer. How it works is pregnant caribou are captured, tranquilized outside of the pen, moved into the pen to give birth, and the calves live there with their mothers for the first few months, and they're protected from predation by wolves, and they're only released once they have a better chance of surviving. It's a huge amount of effort. Saulteaux and West Moberly each have appointed guardians that maintain a 24-hour watch over the pen. There's 15-foot-high walls, 2 layers of electric fencing, community members, so the guardians do a 2-week on, 1 week off, or 2-week off shift. Living up there, it's on the side of a mountain, like a 2-hour drive from the nearest paved road. Community members handpick 400 bags of lichen, which is caribou's preferred food. They handpick that every year to feed the caribou. So a ton of effort. And fast forwarding to today, the effort has paid off. This herd, the Clinsay Za herd, hit 101 members, up from 38 when the penning started. And it's the only herd in the region that's really shown any meaningful recovery, at least until very recently. The challenge that the penning faces, though, is that it is happening amid a completely business-as-usual landscape. So caribou are really an exemplar of this extinction paradox that Jess opened the talk with. They arguably have all the protections available to them as a terrestrial species in Canada. So they are listed with Canada's Species at Risk Act, and they have been since it was enacted in 2002. This is like our Endangered Species Act in Canada. The herds here in Northeast BC were originally listed as threatened and then upgraded to endangered in 2014. Caribou are also subject to treaty and Indigenous rights. So Treaty 8, which I mentioned before, was signed in 1899. It guarantees all First Nation signatories the right to hunt caribou and other species in the treaty area. And this will come up again later in the talk. Caribou are also very well studied. We have reams of data, excellent science. The science is very robust, so we know why they're declining. We have good population data over time. Caribou are also a very charismatic large mammal. We're not talking about like a lowly beetle or worm that nobody has heard of, right? Caribou are actually a national symbol in Canada. They are on the quarter, so quite a renowned species. And then we have also Canada, this country that I mentioned that has these supposedly very strong laws. So caribou, we think, are kind of like the species that should have it all, right? All of the explanations for why species might decline or be people wouldn't care, or they don't hold for caribou. But across Canada, all caribou herds are at risk of extinction, according to the scientist who led the most recent independent assessment of caribou herds, Justina Ray. BC is home to 55 caribou herds. Every one of them is listed with the Species at Risk Act. 7 herds have been extirpated since SARA was enacted. So SARA is not, it's a perfect example of the extinction paradox. The Species at Risk Act is not preventing extirpation. And caribou are also a very classic case in the sense that their endangerment is pretty much exclusively due to extractive land use change that destroys their habitat. So forestry, mining, oil and gas, pipelines, oil and gas exploration, like seismic lines, large dams, all of that has rippled out across these territories in Northeast BC over the last decades. Caribou are very sensitive to this disturbance. They also rely on lichen, as I mentioned, which largely grows in older forests, which are being destroyed through industrial forestry. And then a twist of this story is that extractive landscapes make caribou more vulnerable to wolf predation. So wolves are very good at using extractive landscapes, using roads, seismic lines to cover more ground, spot caribou from farther away. And so this is why you need to protect caribou from wolf predation, because these extractive landscapes make them much more vulnerable to that. Okay, so caribou decline is being driven by extraction, and our research has really, one of the first stages of our research was to show that the BC and federal government, so the state, has played a major role fueling extraction in caribou habitat, despite being formally and professedly committed to caribou recovery. And so we wanted to give you a few snapshots from our and others' research to give you sort of a bit of context on how the state has fueled extraction in Northeast BC in caribou habitat, and also in caribou habitat more broadly. So first of all, sort of the state as an approval machine, so the authorization of extraction function of the state. So we did one of our first studies was of every British Columbia and federal government environmental assessment between 1995 and 2017, and we're updating it right now, for major projects in the country with potential impacts to caribou, negative impacts. So these are mines, pipelines, dams. And we found, the long story short, federal and provincial regulators approved 64 out of 65 major projects with potential adverse effects to caribou. And the one rejection had nothing to do with caribou. And this was not like these impacts were uncertain or marginal. In some cases, the predictions made in the environmental assessments were that the project would wipe out all remaining critical caribou habitat. In most cases, and we could talk a lot more about this in question period because we've become like total environmental assessment nerds. It's like the driest topic, but it's super important, and now something we know quite a bit about. So in most cases, what happens is that regulators assume that the proposed mitigation measures that are identified through the environmental assessment process will render those potential impacts to caribou insignificant. The problem is that we were able to find no peer-reviewed scientific evidence for the effectiveness of these mitigation measures. So major problem there. And then even when adverse effects are recognized through environmental assessment, you might be able to predict this. The decision is let's go ahead with it because the benefits outweigh the costs. The project is still in the national or public interest. So that's the environmental assessment side. Forestry is another area we've looked at. Forestry is the biggest driver of caribou decline. It doesn't go through environmental assessment processes. It has a separate regulatory process of cut block approval. But public interest research by journalists and NGOs has shown that the BC government continues to authorize forest cut blocks in critical caribou habitat, so that's been well established. And then we did a zoom in on a massive forest cut block in the heart of central mountain caribou habitat, right near the Clin-Cesar maternal pen that we showed you in the Peace River region. So this is a huge cut block, and in that cut block we showed that the government authorized harvest, which is called the annual allowable cut, it tripled in the years between the species at risk act coming out and listing caribou, and then today. So a tripling of the authorized harvest and a more than doubling of the actual harvest in this cut block, in this harvesting area in the middle of caribou habitat. So this is a bit of a whirlwind tour. That's forestry. Here on this slide, you can see a map of active oil and gas wells in critical caribou habitat in northeast BC. The caribou habitat is in green and brown. This is a map and a research project that was done by two members of our research team, both master's students at the time, Audrey Irvine Broke and Adriana Di Silvestro. Keep an eye out for their names. Maybe they'll come give a talk here in a couple of years. So they used government data to identify the number of active oil and gas wells operating in government-designated critical caribou habitat in 2020. They found 3,114 wells. So already a good finding, but then they dug below that and also found that more than half of these wells are run by companies that are receiving subsidies from the government, receiving royalty credits in 2019 and 2020. And the wells that are run by subsidies are run by the wells that are run by subsidized companies are in red, the red dots here on the map. Okay, and then a last example of the state's role fueling extraction is this point that Jess already alluded to about the function of the state policing resistance to extraction, right? So in BC, we actually have a special unit of the police, of the RCMP, called the Community Industry Response Group, CIRG, that polices protests against resource extraction in British Columbia. Very controversial in certain circles, as you might imagine. And one really important example to draw your attention to, relevant to caribou, is protests and policing of those protests around the Coastal GasLink pipeline. This involves Wet'suwet'en First Nations, so you may have heard of this in the news. So this pipeline project went through a BC environmental assessment. It was predicted to disturb over 2,700 hectares of caribou habitat. Coastal GasLink refused to comply with government suggestions of restrictions on construction activities during calving periods, and instead Coastal GasLink proposed mitigation measures including avoiding building permanent access to temporary infrastructure and controlling human access to the project area. We could find no scientific evidence to support the effectiveness of those mitigation strategies. The government admitted that there was no evidence for those mitigation strategies. The environmental assessment for this project did conclude that the project had significant adverse effects for caribou, especially two herds that are already very highly disturbed in this area. So they said, and I quote, "The project is likely to negatively impact caribou recovery objectives." BC government approved the project anyway, in the national interest, as they said, they claimed, and Coastal GasLink crosses Wet'suwet'en First Nations traditional territory, and the nation and their allies have been trying to prevent the construction of the pipeline for 4 years now, maybe over 4 years. The RCMP, the cops in British Columbia, have spent, get this, over $37 million policing Wet'suwet'en resistance to Coastal GasLink since 2019. An astronomical sum. And really, there's so much more to say there about the style of policing that they have employed. Very heavy-handed. So Wet'suwet'en and other First Nations are justifiably concerned about these extractive projects' adverse impacts, including impacts to caribou. They know that they disproportionately bear the costs of this extractive development. right? So this brings us to our first research question about who bears the costs and who gets the benefits of extractive land use change. Jess.
All right, I'm back. So first, who bears the costs? Studies have shown that extractive development can have profound negative social impacts, particularly along gendered and colonial lines. The Canadian federal government had an inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and it dedicated a fairly substantial section to that report on how extraction in its construction and operation phases leads to increased violence against women, especially Indigenous women. Wet'suwet'en actually appealed Coastal GasLink's approval on these grounds, arguing the BC government didn't consider the pipeline's potential impacts on Indigenous women in its environmental assessment. The appeal was unsuccessful. Research that we've done as well out of our group shows that gendered impacts of extraction are very weakly considered in environmental assessment, if they're considered at all. Extraction, particularly extraction causing caribou declines, has also been called an act of environmental racism, a kind of interesting use of that term, not typically used to talk about wildlife decline. Environmental racism, as you know here very well, arose out of the civil rights movement in the US. It describes racialized patterns of differential exposure to environmental harms and limiting access to resources. Empirically, what this means is the polluting sites are disproportionately located to Indigenous communities, Black communities, low-income communities. And so a member of the West Moberly wrote an academic paper that really explains the consistent relegating of caribou to like a sacrificial population as an act of environmental racism against the West Moberly and Saulteaux First Nations, because these nations' ways of life and cultural survival are negatively impacted with caribou declines. So it's clear who bears the costs of extraction, but there's this other research question, which is who gets the benefits? Well, there's a few things to say here. The first one is the sort of common sense line that we get from government, from the state, really, is that we all benefit from it, right? Extraction is in the national interest. And it does definitely provide jobs and generate state revenue. But ours and other research shows that forecasts and reports on extraction's economic benefits can be exaggerated, and the benefits are distributed highly unevenly. So again, just to say a little bit more about some research we've done, we did a study of coal mines in Central Mountain caribou habitat. There are 3 coal mines there. This is metallurgical coal. We did what we called an economic benefit audit. That meant comparing forecasted economic benefits from these mines' environmental assessments to actual benefits they produced. So environmental assessments don't just tell us what the potential impact of an extractive activity will do. They're also meant to predict what kind of economic benefits that the state is expected to obtain and jobs that are created. They are never followed up on, it turns out, but we did some research that did this follow-up to say, okay, this is what you predicted, how much actually was delivered, and there we found in a 20-year period, there was significant economic underperformance. Only 34% of tax revenue was generated, 59% of employment, which was very boom and bust compared to what was forecasted. So this was, it was sort of like a surprising, not surprising sort of finding, but it did get a lot of media in the province as well, because there's very little research and study that really follows up on these big promises, predictions that are the most influential in sort of turning the state decision-making one way or another. We also found through this research that the major beneficiaries were shareholders, not in Canada, from Australia and South Africa, UK. We're doing a new study right now that looks at all the mines in British Columbia in a moment of sort of critical mineral boom, which states are sort of jockeying, right, for position to produce these minerals, transition minerals, and Canada is one of these. And so again, here the predictions are just off the charts, billions and billions of dollars if we really dig into becoming a critical mineral producer. And so we're doing a study of all the mines in British Columbia right now, an audit in this way. When it comes to forestry, forest companies and the government tout the industry's role as an employment engine in the province, but jobs per cubic meter of harvest have steadily declined over the last 3 decades, shown here, consistent with a trend over the last century. The BC government also collects less in stumpage, resource rent, than it costs to actually run the Ministry of Forests, the bureaucracy that is meant to manage this sustainably. Of course, workers do collect wages, but it's important to know these sectors have highly gendered and racialized divisions of labor. According to Statistics Canada, over 80% of resource sector employees are men. They also rely on temporary foreign workers to support the sector, who are largely in service roles, janitorial, fast food services, and this is a part of the research we're turning to now. So the picture that really emerges when it comes to the geographic distribution of costs and benefits, what is the picture that emerges when you look at that all? It's really a picture that can only be described as extractivism, which is a concept born out of anti-colonial Latin American struggle that really describes these patterns of hyper-extraction, large-scale, export-oriented resource extraction with these very lopsided costs and benefits. Extractivism is a mode of accumulation where some people's ecologies and health are permanently impaired as a result of activities that do not, by and large, benefits them, with the benefits siphoned off elsewhere. And so as this really suggests, these are systems of power that underpin these geographical maldistributions of benefit and harm. We particularly see that extractivism relies on patriarchal, racial, and colonial systems of power, which devalue some people, positioning them as less, as harmable, exploitable. These harms to women, especially to Indigenous women, are disregarded. And again, our research really looks into really demonstrate that empirically, right, through this studies of environmental impact assessment. In the Peace River region, the West Moberly and Soto have been publicly subject to direct racism in pushback to their efforts to protect caribou. So this narrative that we all benefit, that extraction is universally benefit, really hides these patterns, and it's an important sleight of hand accompanies the state's repeated claims of general interest. This claim is consistent with enduring global pattern that goes back to the beginning of colonialism, whereas Jamaican theorist Sylvia Wynter describes colonists' own self-interest is represented as though it is in everyone's interest.
All right, so we've sort of started to allude to those systems of power that uphold these geographical maldistributions, which we can talk more about, and we would love to know if there's connections that you can make to your own thinking and classes. But I'll now move on, we're getting close to the end of the talk, to the question of why the state does this. So the why question. Why does the state fuel extraction in endangered caribou habitat, the same state that's committed to caribou recovery, and the same state that's a signatory to treaties and Indigenous rights and a constitution that is that officially protects Indigenous ways of life? Why does the state do this? So this part, I'm going to move quite quickly because there's a ton to say here. Political theorists have a lot to say. So our research and our reading in political theory suggests that state fuel extraction to meet several imperatives. So some of these imperatives include revenue generation, supporting capitalist growth and accumulation. This is a long-standing imperative of the state. States fuel extraction to meet an imperative of legitimation. This is an imperative of democratic states that need the legitimacy to govern from their citizenry. And here, the reading that we've especially done and the research is focused in particular on the way that states mobilize this idea of the general interest. So states at least have to appear to be working in the interests of everyone or in the interests of the public, right? Whether or not they are actually doing that is a separate matter, but the appearance of working in the general interest, which may at times involve offering concessions to more subordinate social classes, that is a function of the state that maintains, well, hegemony, really, which is something we could talk more about in the question period. A fourth imperative that the state meets by fueling extraction is to maintain internal order and protect against external threats. And I've sort of combined two imperatives together there. But this maintenance of internal order and protection against external threats means something very specific in a settler colonial context, right? In a context in British Columbia, Treaty 8 is unusual. Most of the province has no treaties. The Canada's and BC's own courts have acknowledged that the land question is unsettled. Indigenous groups have title to the land, but it's just not actually officially been recognized in specific places. But this means that sovereignty is very contested, right? So maintaining internal order, the state's imperative to maintain internal order, over the last 100 plus years in BC has been about maintaining a very particularly colonial order, right? Protecting its own sovereignty, its own monopoly on the legitimate use of force in the given territory. And then casting Indigenous challenges to that as external threats. So I think you can take this common state imperative of maintenance of internal order and protection against external threats and think about it in a specific way in a colonial context. So speaking to these imperatives, there's a theorist named Daniel Hosknost who offers a particularly useful concept for understanding why the state is doing what it does and what the limits are when it comes to state environmental action. He says that there is a glass ceiling on how far states will go to environmental ends. And it's these existing imperatives that states have that form that glass ceiling. So states will only follow through with environmental action if it does not threaten their ability to achieve one of those existing imperatives, like legitimation, revenue generation, capital accumulation, right? So it's a pretty persuasive argument that Hosknost makes. And he says, any attempt to add a sustainability imperative onto those other imperatives, it's too much in conflict with the existing imperatives. States can add imperatives, and they have over time, but they've only been able to add ones that can coexist with the ones that they already have. Great paper on this that I do recommend that you read if you're interested. So yes, all of that, yes. But our research shows that the state is approving extraction, fueling extraction, without actually any economic benefit. Like, it's approving these mines that are economic disasters over and over again. So, the extraction that the state is approving is vastly under-delivering on its economic predictions. What this suggests is that the glass ceiling propelling caribou to extinction is not only made up of a profit imperative or a revenue generation imperative, right? And instead, where this starts to get us is to what I started to talk about when I talked about the maintenance of internal order in a settler colonial context. So what we would say back to Hosknost, and we will try to say in our book that we're going to write this summer, hopefully, is that state imperatives, these state imperatives are deeply shaped by forces of difference making. So racial, colonial, gendered, and anthropocentric. So legitimacy, for example, historically and arguably today, reflects a deeply colonial gendered ways of understanding what progress is, what a good life is, what a good job is, right? What it means to act as a legitimate government, right? It influences that. These racial, colonial, gendered, anthropocentric forces shape what legitimacy looks like. And they shape what costs are considered justified in the pursuit of that good life or progress. So the glass ceiling, we suggest, is upheld also by the gendered and racialized nature of the state. So the state invests in extractive development, as we have already shown, that largely employs men, has been linked to increases in violence against women, particularly Indigenous women, relies on temporary foreign worker programs that have very highly racialized divisions of labor. So all of this is part of the extractive complex. And then maybe one of our biggest arguments about why the state is doing, so this question, why does the state approve uneconomic mines that destroy caribou habitat? Our hypothesis here is that caribou are held in this doomed place also because of colonial power in particular. So the colonial piece is very important here. So learning from scholars like Audra Simpson, Leanne Simpson, Deb Cowan, Sherry Pasternak, The settler colonial context of BC is a huge part of the explanation for why the state is doing what it's doing. From the beginning of colonization, mining and extraction have been a key way that the settler colonial state has actually enacted its sovereign authority in a material, physical way, right? So reproducing settler state claims to sovereignty is done through extraction. And this still happens today, and it's very potent because of in part because of the very unsettled nature of settler sovereignty in this place in particular. Right? So extractive activities are a way that the state maintains sovereignty in this unsettled jurisdictional context, in what Audra Simpson calls a situation of nested sovereignties. So colonial, racial, gendered systems of power are part of forming the glass ceiling. They're part of shaping whose interests get to appear as general, what kind of order is pursued, and who or what is viewed as a threat to that order. I'm concluding? All right. Conclusion. So we are in this moment where globally and in Canada, species remain caught in the grip of extractive development. And scientists are very clear that stopgap measures like caribou maternal penning are an important way to preserve the last of the species, but they are not enough, not by a long shot. If we want to protect wild species and ecosystems and recover them to abundance, we cannot keep converting their habitat to extractive landscapes. The state cannot keep fueling extraction. So what we've done in this talk is make the case that extraction is not only upheld by market forces, by the pursuit of capitalist accumulation, but also by systems of oppression, racism, patriarchy, and colonialism that feed an appearance of extraction benefiting everyone, when in reality the costs and benefits are extremely unevenly distributed. And so one of the lessons that we've drawn from our last 5 years of research is that environmental degradation, and this is a very common argument among political ecologists, environmental degradation, whether we're talking about climate change or species loss, shares structural roots with other kinds of crises, right? Crises of indigenous dispossession, of gendered violence, of racial violence, racial exploitation in labor forces. Oh, we've lost our last page somehow. What was the last? So what this, then now I'm going to go completely off script, but where this takes us, and this actually leads very nicely into the question period because I would love to hear anybody's ideas about this. But some of the most convincing things that I've read about how do you respond to species loss, how do you respond to these environmental problems? If the root of these problems is something like the endurance of an extractive complex, then we need to respond to the extraction itself. Right? And so it may be that one of the most effective ways to respond to something like caribou loss is actually through solutions that might not look environmental at all, that might be about instead, battling, like refusing or contesting gender violence, a wealth tax that tries to redistribute resources, right? Because this inequality of resources is part of maintaining the extractive complex. Standing up against exploitative migrant labor in these extractive industries. Like all of these are, and so it sounds quite daunting because you're like, the problem is so much bigger than species loss or caribou loss. But the good news is that it means that there are these kinds of alliances that can ideally be made across these struggles because these crises are connected and because they share these structural roots. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Do we have the
Any questions?
mics from the side, or do we have to pass the mics around?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Do we have questions?
You caribou lovers out there?
Has anyone seen a caribou?
Yeah.
They peed on my stuff.
Where?
I was in Alaska and we had we needed to get refueled, resupplied, and so our stuff was in this corner and we were over here waiting for the bush plane, and then we were like, oh my god, that caribou's taking all our stuff, and then
That's a good claim to fame, I think. Yeah. That's where I saw caribou also is in Alaska. Yeah, in Denali National Park.
I was in the Chugach Mountains.
Wow.
So random. But with the mothering pen, when you said they released them back, do you know if they put them back with hers or very good question.
One of the things we didn't mention is that they also they do a big wolf cull all around them. So the primary strategy to reduce impacts of extraction on caribou has been to really go at their primary predators. So they before they release them, they kind of go around and eliminate as many wolves as possible, and then they release them all together.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
They said the first year that they released the mothers and the calves, they didn't do a wolf call, and the wolves were just literally waiting outside the doors.
Wolves are
Yeah.
smart. Yeah.
Yeah.
We've got some good stories.
But there's great stats there too. Like the BC government has spent over $10 million on the wolf call in the last 5 years. I think so. It's and it's also, as you might imagine, extremely controversial. Do I need a? Do we need a?
You asked me. I think it's Rosemary.
Oh,
Yeah. So they do release them together.
and it's also amazing. Like some of the same caribou come back. Like we saw, they were like, oh, this mother has delivered like 5 or 6 different calves. Yeah.
I think there were 20 mums in the pen. Yeah. So there's a large group of them. It's really a special place. Yeah. Very cool. Go ahead.
How do you think we can leverage the contradictions and hypocrisy that's within this paradigm, and because it seems to show that the system is very fragile, not actually offering benefits, and it's the logic behind it isn't actually sound, and it's rooted rather in it's rather rooted in this school of thought of white world makers and extractivism, and so yeah, I guess my question is how to leverage it, and do you think that leveraging it through indigenous epistemology, storytelling, and oral histories or ceremonies could be a way for policy to kind of actually change the relationship that we have to the land, because that seems to be the root issue. So if yeah, I think I said that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, I guess I can say they already, the nations, the West Mobility and Soto in this area are already doing that. I think one of the most effective things they've done, in addition to pointing the way forward with this pen and the kind of level of care and attention to restoration, is they also regularly hold the government to account. So they've been at the forefront of some important court cases. So when developments come forward that they think are counter their interests and their own sort of legal systems, they will take the government to court on them, and there has been a few successes there as well. And then BC in British Columbia right now is trying to align all of its legal systems with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There's a lot. There's a DRIPA. There's an act in BC that's meant to sort of begin this process. It's very slow, and the impact is not yet clear on it, but there is an effort to do that, and there are some really active. Right now, for example, they're redrafting the Emergency Act in British Columbia to be in alignment with DRIPA. What that looks like coming out the other end is going to be the question, but there's movement in that direction.
Maybe I'll add. I just partly wanted to say thank you because I feel like I was like, oh, yes, you got it. That was basically actually the 30-second version of our talk that we could probably have given. So very well put. Yeah, so I like where you're imagining a response lying, and like Jess said, nations are very active on this front in a bunch of different ways in BC. We are really lucky to intersect our work with them at times, but our focus has been more on trying to exploit those inconsistencies and paradoxes and contradictions, as you said. So really trying to go after these prized narratives of everyone benefits, or right now the narrative in BC is that there's all this wealth, but it is being hindered by an overly lengthy regulatory approval process. And so we're like, ooh, let's see, is that actually true? No, actually, our review of all the mines, none of them have been delayed by environmental regulation. So it's kind of just like this myth-busting project. I mean, we're both white settler scholars, so it also shapes how we're positioned. So we've been giving, rather than trying to, deliver a message, we're trying to deliver a message that's compatible with Indigenous nations, but more like this kind of quantitative myth busting. So we've given talks to 100 environmental assessment bureaucrats. Some of the mining bureaucrats were trying to radicalize the bureaucracy a little bit. That's kind of been our strategy on that front, but it really is about trying to exploit those contradictions that you identified.
To go off of that, what has that process of radicalizing bureaucracy been like? What has worked, what hasn't? Where have you found the tension is especially peaked? We're not even going to talk about that. To the I'm surprised that there's engagement around this, and have you seen effect in any kind of longer lasting way besides just the then and there?
Well. It's a really good question. And one is a mine. So so I'll give you the big win. And then I'll tell you the sad things after that. But the big win was these 3 coal mines in critical caribou habitat, actually not far from where the pens are, that we did this economic sort of audit, which was a helpful piece of research when there was a new proposed, another metallurgical coal mine was proposed, Sukunka, in the same region, and West Moberly again and Soto both were against this mine in their territory, and our research was part of a wide amount of advocacy that went into that being the first ever rejection, actually, of a coal mine in because of caribou, for caribou reasons.
Of any major project.
Of any major project, yeah. So that was there were many things going on. I think I just wouldn't want to overstate our research, but I mean, that's the same with every kind of political win, right? It's many things coming together. We can say more about that if you're interested, that rejection. I would say that our discussions with bureaucrats have been a little bit more depressing. When we gave this talk to this big sort of environmental assessment, they invited us to give a talk on our research, and at the end they were kind of like, can you help us? What kind of questions do you think we should be asking to proponents of major projects? And we kind of looked at each other like, but isn't that your job? But they were open. Yeah. So I guess that's the positive part, is there's been a real openness. I don't know, do you want to say more?
Maybe I'll just add, I would say what you asked, where the limit has been kind of, and we were originally quite heartened by the receptiveness and the openness. We met with this bureaucrat who was tasked with heading up a new follow-up program for environmental assessment federally, which is very important because follow-up is just not done ecologically or economically, as we talked about. And we met, and he was one of those slippery kind of people, great, but when it came down to it, wanting to actually make it so that companies have to annually submit the amount of tax and the jobs that they're actually producing, no. The economic, and any economic follow-up was just, so that was a limit. Although in Newfoundland and Labrador, they do this for offshore oil. It's one of the only jurisdictions we were able to find in the whole world that does any economic follow-up. And it's for jobs and local purchasing, not taxes. But yeah, anyway, that was where, but that just makes you think that's, again, that makes me even more interested in this tension and contradiction. This is something to pursue. So that's why we scaled up to all of BC but the data is not available because of no follow-up, so that's a limitation. But yeah, great question.
Thank you. And the room is mostly filled with students from a land-based learning program, so the talk was fantastic, thank you. Specifically looking at foodways. I just want to point out, we probably all noted it, but you modeled for us what, at the end of our equity symposium last week, was argued could be a way of critically mobilizing white privilege. And your focus on myth busting and looking at the narratives, pointing out the contradictions. I hope we all noted that as one way that the white privilege that you have as researchers or scholars could actually be, the language was mobilized last week. So I think that was fantastic for us to see. Specific questions, if you're willing, your research question slide, if you'd be willing to talk about your interviews and your field site methodology. Most of the students in the room are going to be doing their own research projects. And you talked quite a bit about the inductive content analysis, which I'm calling the mobilizing white privilege. But if you're willing to say more about the interview process or methodology you use. And then you've cited several references. I'm wondering, can we get the PowerPoint maybe at the end of our program? Great. And then two last ones that are related. We're reading Leanne Simpson, we just did this week. If either of you would say more, because I neglected to say she's also a musician rock star, which did not come out in my presentation.
I saw her perform in Montreal, it was amazing, yeah.
So that context, and then what's replacing caribou meat in diets? They're all connected.
What's replacing caribou meat in diet depends on the nation, but moose is some nations that we've spoken with have said moose is the most important, but they decided to pursue caribou for strategic reasons, which, yeah, it's interesting. Hey, maybe that's all I'll say. Other food, and one of the interesting things that I've also learned by attending a lot of caribou workshops and conferences is that, so it's not just like caribou's value is so much beyond sustenance. Like I talked about their caribou being part of knowledge transmission and legal orders. So one of the ways that works is that there's only certain stories are only told when caribou hunting. And so there's been, when you don't caribou hunt, it means there's generations of youth that go without learning skills, stories. And so some nations have actually started to tell those stories in practices of caribou monitoring and community monitoring instead of caribou hunting. So that's been an adaptation, like a cultural adaptation that's quite interesting. So I started with the last question there.
On the methods question, I think it's really, it's, both of us came from previous research projects where we did a lot of more ethnographic participant observation and interviews. And frankly, I always found that I personally hated asking people for their time to do that. And I think that becomes even more like front of mind when you're interested in an issue that an Indigenous nation's working on, where people are extremely busy and time constrained. And so that wasn't an explicit rationale behind kind of going more to the state archive, because really there's just like an enormous archive of material to work with if you're trying to understand kind of what the state does, like its practices. So I think in part it was that, you know, this kind of turn to the documents and this kind of content analysis was in part just because it seemed like it was better to answer the kinds of questions we were asking, right, than, you know, interviews as well. But I guess, what kind of interviews have we done? Well, only a few.
Yeah, I think really we've done informational interviews for the most part, like expert interviews, where we're not interviewing multiple people and sort of identifying patterns. We're like, okay, we want to talk to the forest economist. Like, you know, Jess had a Zoom meeting with a forest economist to get particular information. So it's been a very iterative process of going into the documents, developing questions. How does the Ministry of Forests, what is their economic economic model that they use to project the number of jobs that would be lost if you stopped cutting X amount of wood. And so really coming up with very targeted questions and interviewing experts who can hopefully answer them. That's been the interview methodology, I would say, for the most part. And then the field visit, it came last year. We'd already been doing the work for many years. Partly COVID had delayed, but our approach with the field visit, and it was not a deliberate methodological strategy. It was like, we were invited up there by the member of West Moberly who did the project on the paper on environmental racism, and they were very kind to tour us around all the extractive landscapes and attend a feast and just sort of be there. It was, I guess the thing that I would say about it is, having myself done previously a lot of participant observation research, where I would go and, I like worked at a wildlife rehabilitation center, and I was constantly like field notes, like, oh, interesting. It was so nice to go up north and just hang out and not feel like, and we really did want to, like, we want to avoid any like extractive research, right? Which means both not, like at time, just hanging out, and then trying to be reciprocal with what we find out. And like I said, align our projects. But yeah, there was a question in there about Leanne Simpson's work. Just who she is. Yeah, she's Anishinaabe scholar, artist, musician, really just such a mother, like writes a lot about motherhood and performs about motherhood, teacher. Yeah. Based
Canadian icon.
Up there.
Which actually, might do her a bit of a disservice even to call her that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is about Norman Simpson because we read a piece by her that kind of critiques traditional ways of, or like how, approaches to trying to indigenize Western academia. And how do you all respond to that as white scholars within Western academia trying to transform it, and reconcile that with what Leanne Simpson says in her work, which is she doesn't quite say it like this, but like it's kind of why participating in systems that are not functional, and why it's maybe we need to start something completely different, blend pedagogy, remove ourselves from these systems altogether. So how do you reconcile that or navigate that?
You don't. Or maybe you do for a minute and then you don't. It's like a constant process of self-interrogation, and because it's, I think, related to this. One of the main critiques that a lot of Indigenous scholars have made of like indigenizing the university is the way that it is done so extractively, right? It's ultimately about shoring up white power of the university, or just a kind of liberal politics of recognition that doesn't disturb any of the power relations, doesn't give land back or even work towards that. So I think it's just like in a personal way about kind of continually asking yourself if you're engaging with the work in a way that is, well, first of all, true to, or as best as it can be, true to the work itself and the struggles that gave birth to that work. So really trying to never trying to never separate the ideas from the political struggles and aims that are animating the ideas and the theory. That's a really core learning, I think, that goes back also to engagement with Black scholars' work, not just Indigenous scholars' work. I don't know, do you want to add anything, Jess? It's such a good question. It's an ongoing.
But I also feel like we just can't we can't have our politics led by purity either, right? And so just recognizing that contradiction and that tension that is always there feels to me more productive than trying to find a way to inhabit this deeply imperfect world in a sort of pure way. So I don't know. I want wanted to invite you all to, Anthony mentioned, that I'm involved at the Center for Climate Justice, at UBC, University of there it was. And I have some new research that's coming out with actually a good friend of Anthony's, Patrick Bigger, was involved in this project. And so this is a webinar where we're releasing this research that's really, has a very similar sort of orientation and line of questioning that Rosemary asked on the Caribou Project, but really scaled up, where we're thinking through, at the global level, how is it that we've had, 30 years of a biodiversity convention, that I've been very involved in the Convention on Biological Diversity, that has made many, many agreements, and states have committed to targets and failed them a million times, and just how do we explain this, right? And so this is some research that really looks at the way in which the international financial system and relations of subordination, financial subordination, are sort of, we need to reckon with those instead of, or in addition to kind of, expanding protected areas and generating more finance for protected areas, that there's a real need to hit to kind of these processes and systems in the global economy. And you can come to the webinar if you're interested. It's very early in the morning because many people that are on this panel are coming from various parts of the world. Anyway, thank you.
Hopefully you all will be joining the Farm Worker Justice Day later as well. Packed day of events for everybody to attend. Thank you so much for your awesome questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Questions, and Sarah, thank you always for bringing the wonderful students and joining us.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Or how did you ask us for that webinar I missed?
Yeah, it's in the slide deck, so these.
Well, yeah, you can share it. Yeah.
I'll post the slide deck.
Yeah. Great.
Anything else? Any plugs, Michael, for CCAS?
For CCAS, not as much. Oh, actually, I guess I think this will get announced next week, but we have 2 resources that are CCAS that are meant for students, either if you're graduating or continue next year. One of them is like a database that has all the kind of Thurston County events and such. So it has this one listed on it. So it's like one spot to go to find out something that's happening in every sector, rather than having to go to 6 Instagrams and their websites. The other thing too is we have a project database. So if you are graduating and you have unfinished works that you want to live on, we'll be having, I think, May 29th a day where people can kind of bring their projects. We'll have a student worker submit it into the logs. That way it can be saved for a fall quarter person, so your mini-me can continue it on. And is it okay if I do a CEC plugin?
Yeah.
So not CCAS, but how many people know about the Clean Energy Committee as a grant fund? Okay, well, you don't count. You are aware. But yeah, I guess, question, how many folks are continuing into fall quarter next year? Okay, we got a few folks. How many people care about topics like this and want to see more discussions on campus like this? How many people want to help support their student workers and faculty bringing their projects to life? Okay, so if you answered your hands yes to all of those or any of those, the Clean Energy Committee basically is a student-led committee where you award grant money based on student fees to supporting projects that address topics like this, usually on campus, but also can be used for bringing in guest speakers. It's definitely separate from CCAS, but if you're interested, they are hiring pretty much, I think, through this week until I think week 7 is when applications close. There's a post over there that has some information, and it'll get put out on Inside Evergreen. But if you're interested, it pays, I think, per quarter, $535 a quarter. It's usually 2 hours a week of just meeting with 4 other students to talk about how can we make sure that projects are being met and supported on campus. Yeah.
Can I plug for this? You all know Sarah Dyer?
Yeah.
I love the word that was used was audaciousness. Sarah met with a group and wrote up 2 proposals that might have some action moving forward. An electric vehicle that's refrigerated for use with the farm, and a high tunnel that doesn't get torn apart in the storms. Last week's plastic just got tracked again over the weekend. So those are really concrete examples of students taking forward projects. And I think what Michael's suggesting is you can actually be paid to be one of the students that decides how the money gets spent.
Yeah, if you have questions about what that's like, feel free to chat with me anytime you run into me on campus. house. I think after this, another thing too is we're having a sustainable designer from San Francisco is visiting over in Seminar 2E building on the 3rd floor. So I'll be hanging out there for like, I think until 3 o'clock if you want to ask about it. As an undergraduate, I was on the CEC and it was a really great experience. It's great for resumes, great for just professional skills and development. There's everything from outreach coordinator to project manager to like keeping in contact with Sarah Dyer to be like, hey, $20,000 is coming your way, hint, hint.
Is that true?
Should be, yeah. I think they're meeting, they had to do an emergency hearing for Monday, but so if you have questions, feel free to ask about it, or you can visit evergreen.edu/climate and you can find all of our links there. So, yeah, well, that's it, I think, for me. All right, now for food. Yeah, of course, yeah.